Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers. Welcome to this session of Meezan lecture series. You would recall that before the month of Ramadan, we were studying Ustaz Javed Ghamidi's book Meezan, which is basically his understanding of Islam. And we have studied various chapters like the political Sharia, the economic Sharia, and currently we were studying the social Sharia. And today we'll, in fact, be taking our last lesson from the social Sharia. And the all important topic that we are going to discuss today is the issue of slavery, which in fact Islam inherited at the times of the Quranic revelations. So, up till now, you would recall the chapters that we have studied, or the section that we have studied in the social Sharia. They include nikah, or marriage, which of course details out some of the important conditions of marriage, and at the same time, it also gives us an insight into the marriages of the Prophet. And we also find, as far as this issue of marriage is concerned, what are the prerequisites and what are the conditions. We studied relations prohibited for marriage, which are basically divided into three, like relationships which are prohibited by virtue of lineage. Then we have relationships which are prohibited by virtue of fosterage, and finally by marriage itself. So these relations which are prohibited, for example, blood relatives, which of course are mentioned in this regard, and then other details have also been sorted out. The third topic that we discussed were the bounds and conditions of marriage, and the fourth one included rights and obligation of the spouses. And both rights and obligations, of course, they had been dealt with in detail, because on these rights and obligations depend the prosperity of the family. Fifthly, we studied polygamy, which of course is something which was rampant in the times of the Prophet, and it was limited to a certain number and also made conditional to justice. So we had discussed that as far as an ideal family is concerned, the Almighty created Adam and Eve to signify that it ideally comes into being through the union of a single husband and wife, and it is only through, in certain condensed circumstances, that this institution of polygamy is allowed. Sixthly, we studied the etiquette of sexual intimacy. Again, this is something of a very important nature, because there are a lot of misconceptions regarding this topic, which is like a taboo topic. It is seldom discussed, and there is also a lot of disinformation found regarding sexual intimacy and education related to sex, which of course includes education of our children as well as adults. Seventhly, we studied Ilah, which is a particular form of separation in the times of Prophet Muhammad. It, in fact, is a form of oath in which a person would swear. He would take this oath that he will not have any sexual relation with his wife, and the Almighty warned them that they have to come to a certain decision, and they just cannot leave their wives into a limbo. So they either must continue these relations or gracefully withdraw from them. So this Ilah is basically an oath which was taken by people to not have sexual relations with their wife. And then we discussed zihar, which was a particular form of divorce in again the times of Jahiliyyah, in which a person would regard his wife to be his mother, and therefore he would say that just as his mother is prohibited to him, the wife is also prohibited. So this custom was also rooted out, and people who would persist, they were prescribed with certain punishments and certain atonements. We also discuss directives related to widows, which of course are a very, very weak section of society. So widows, they have to be taken care of, not only by the state, but also as an extension of the directive of a person who has passed away, and his duty to look after his wife continues for one more year when he passes away. And the Quran says that he must provide or make a will to provide 1 year's residence and maintenance for his wife, so that she's not left high and dry. 11thly, we studied the norms of gender interaction. This again is a topic which has caused a lot of confusion and misconception. So we would discuss how these union or this interaction between men and women who are unrelated, how the Quran deals with them, and how it does not at all foresee a segregated society, which is more of a cultural thing. It envisages a society in which men and women, they can work together, they can live together, they can sit together, eat together, and they have to observe certain norms as far as this is concerned. Twelfthly, we have discussed directives relating to parents. This, of course, also is something very important because parents, particularly when they reach old age and they become jittery and in fact they become more childlike, that children who are adult, they are warned, they are admonished that they must not be disrespectful to their parents in any way, because this is the right that they have on every child. Remember, when the child was being reared by them, was being groomed by them, and they would tolerate and put up with all sorts of tantrums. So it is not befitting at all if now the parent needs such attention that the children should speak to them in such harsh tones. Yeah, 13th topic that we discussed was related to the orphans, which of course are a weak section of the society, especially in the times of the Prophet, when once a person's father would die, he would again be left to the mercy of his relatives, of and of course uh, many other relatives, which of course, although were part of his tribe, but then he was or she was dependent on these relations. So the Quran has copiously discussed orphans at various instances and said that they must be taken care of, they must be provided for, and if it is easier to provide for them by marrying their mothers, then that too should be done. At the same time, at another instance, it is also said that if you have to look after these orphans as guardians, then remember that a guardian who is rich must not in any way benefit from the money. That a guardian who is poor or is not able to look after himself in a way, but he has to maintain that orphan, so he can benefit from the money of the orphan just to sustain himself and not consume it, thinking that the orphans would soon grow up and then he would have to hand over the money back to him or to them. So this is a general overview of what we have discussed in the past weeks just before Ramadan. So today, as I said, we will be discussing the last topic of this social Sharia, and inshallah next week we'll be beginning with another one. And the topic at hand is the issue of slavery. Now, this issue has been a sore thorn, I would say, in Islamic directives, and the general view about is that today, if there is a war between non-Muslim nation and between Muslims, then slaves can be captured, and not only captured, but women from the opposite side or the warring enemy can be captured, and they can be made slaves to the conquering or the warring army, distributed among them, and these soldiers or whoever they are assigned to, they can have intimacy with them, can have sexual relations with them. And generally this is the view that as far as slavery is concerned, this is something which Islam still envisages. It still uh, propagates and says that if there is a war, then we can capture the women of the warring army and treat them as our own slaves. So so much so that I'd like to narrate to you an incident in the times that I was growing up in our university days. This is about 40 years ago, maybe. I remember our physics professor, who was a very, very educated person, a PhD from a foreign university, a very uh, true scholar of his subject, and someone who was very serious, someone who always took his subject very seriously, and he would teach us in a very, very efficient way. So he once walked into our classroom, and I remember it was perhaps 1984, which is like 40 years ago, and this was a time in which the Indian and the Pakistani armies were facing each other at the border. And I remember Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister of India, and it was at that instance that we were actually spending days. And I remember it was the month of October also, incidentally, and it was October of 1984, and so our teacher merrily walked in one day, and before he even began his lesson, he said that, well, if there is going to be a war between India and Pakistan, I'm going to capture Indira Gandhi and make her my slave. And all of us in the class, we were shocked, we were shell shocked, and we didn't know what to say, that here is a professor who is such an erudite person, such a learned person, not that religious, so to speak, but when it comes to slavery, when it comes to making someone slave, such is the rampant nature of this concept that even a person like him had the audacity or had this desire to say that, well, if there is a war between India and Pakistan, he will make Indira Gandhi as a slave lady. So the shock that came to us, of course, I mean, that shock is still continuing after 40 years. Whenever I recall that incident, it sends goosebumps down my skin. And it also goes to show that how deeply rooted this issue is, that even people who are not that deeply religious, they think that this is a right that they have, and Islam has given sanction to slavery, and have we have to have intimate relations with slave women. Let me also point this out, that the reverse was never the practice in the times of the Prophet. So for example, men, slaves who were men, slave men, they were never intimate with their women masters or mistresses, so to speak. So this custom in Arabia to have sexual relations with slaves just was confined between the master and his slave woman or slave lady. It never happened between between a mistress and her slave man. Another thing that I have found in many societies today is that people who have domestic staff, I mean, they are domestic staff, they are cleaning ladies, they are cleaning maids who come and clean or who do these chores. So I have also seen, to my horror and to my utmost horror, that they are, I mean, the man of the house, the head of the family, he would justify his sexual relations with the maid by saying that she is his slave, and because slavery is something which is permitted in Islam, so even if she's not captured in a war, so what? She's still a domestic servant or a domestic attendant. So I have seen how this directive has stretched to domestic staff as well, and not only being stretched, as I said, it is justified. So, to our horror, of course, now comes this important part that we have to see and discuss, that how come an inhuman institution, which, so to speak, was something that we should have thought, or we would have thought, that Islam has come to totally eliminate it. We end up finding that it is part of our Islamic directives, a very important part. Every single person that you will discuss this issue in with you, whenever you will discuss it, especially with the clergy, you'll find it that they are in favor of this. Not only in favor, they think it's a thing that we have to do. So prisoners of war have to be captured, and those prisoners who are women, they can be distributed among the army and assigned to soldiers or wherever you can send them. And this extramarital contact is something which is which is not proscribed, which is absolutely allowed by religion. Now, let us look at how the Quran has treated this topic, and also see that what exactly is the situation. Now, as far as what I'm going to present today before you, I must also at the outset say that this is how Ustaz Amin Islahi, who is the teacher of our teacher, Ustaz Javed Ghamidi, has presented this point of view in his celebrated treatise, Tadabbur Quran, and shown that how this institution of slavery was never part of Islam, and unfortunately it got mixed up, and certain directives in the Quran which were given at a very specific, with a very specific context, they somehow prevailed, and people thought that slavery was something that was part of the Islamic Sharia. The cause of misconception, it seems, is that slavery was gradually eradicated from the Muslim society. So it was not that it was eradicated all at once. I mean, there are directives in the Quran about which we know that, for example, the Quran says that we must not eat pork, we must not uh, eat anything which is not slaughtered in the name of God. So, for example, these are directives which are given and followed instantly. But as far as slavery was concerned, because it was a deeply rooted phenomenon in the Arab society, because it was part and parcel of the Arab society, you see, there were scores and scores of slaves in every household. And not only slaves, there were generations of slaves living in a house. For example, the grandparent and then the next in kin, and so on and so forth. Like many generations would inhabit the same household, and they would become part of the family. And also, their own moral repute was not that strong. So the slaves, both men and women, the way they were kept and the way their moral conduct was, it left a lot to be desired. So, had an instant directive been given to liberate these slaves, men would have had no option but to become beggars in the society and become an economic burden on the society. And women would have, or these slave women would have turned into prostitutes, because this was what they were doing. I mean, not as prostitutes, but as mistresses of their of their masters, and they would have opened up these dens of prostitution, and this whole institution would have become more prospering in the society. So an instant uh, dismissal or an instant eradication of this institution would have resulted in a huge catastrophe in the society. So Islam actually adopted a gradual way to eliminate the institution of slavery, keeping in view its deeply rooted status in the society. And as I said, had it given an immediate directive, things would have taken a really bad shape. So a very gradual process was adopted, and various measures were taken gradually. I'll describe them before you today. And basically, this would be a summary of Ustaz Amin Islahi's point of view, and see that how gradually, near the end of the Prophet's tenure, a directive was finally given in which it was said that if a slave wants to get himself or herself liberated, then for a certain piece of work or chore, or a guarantee that he or she would not become an economic burden, then every person, every slave man or woman who would demand freedom has to be given that freedom, and no one can in any way stop them from being liberated. But this was a gradual process that was adopted. So, just to give an analogy to you, social customs which are deeply rooted in a society, they cannot be dismissed or they cannot be eradicated by a single stroke. And that would, as I just said, would create a lot of problems and commotion in the society. Take the case of dowry, which is part of many Eastern cultures, especially India and Pakistan, and people who migrate from India and Pakistan to other parts of the world. So the dowry becomes an essential part, and this is something of a burden on the bridegroom's on the bride's family. Actually, the bride has to provide for the things that actually are the responsibility of the bridegroom. So we see in our society, which is basically a poor society, 90% of the people are they have these wants and desires. Over 50% are living below the poverty line. But if you have to get your daughter or your sister married, then unless you give a certain amount of dowry, that wedding is not going to take place. And if you say that you're going to eradicate this custom by not doing so, it's not going to sit well, because when these brides they go to their homes, then they face these allegations and these taunts. So it's like a vicious circle. If they want to do away with something, it becomes still part of it, and if you don't want to do away with it, then it's something which stops marriages from taking place, because unless you have a certain amount or a fair amount of dowry, which costs a huge amount of money, you're not able to get your daughter or your sister married. So for example, if dowry is something that has to be that this has to be reformed, or this custom has to be reformed, then this cannot be done by a single stroke of the pen, or maybe a single ordinance, because it's so deeply rooted that it will take some time. You'll have to change the mindset of people. You'll have to make them realize that this is the responsibility of the groom, not the bride, to bring all sorts of things, and you cannot make a demand. And in fact, it is against decency to ask for the bride's family to give a certain amount of furniture or these essential items of a household. So you would need to do a lot of mind building, a lot of pre marital, you can say, build up is required to change the mindset of the people, and then slowly, of course, this evil custom would be rooted. So in a very similar way, because of its deeply rooted position in the Arab society, the Quran adopted a very gradual way to eradicate it. So it took two very broad, I would say, measures, and one related to the fact that no new slave would be made. Because you see, the greatest source of slavery in the times of the Prophet were these wars, and slaves would be made by capturing prisoners of war and making free people turn into slaves, whether they are men or women, and then they would be distributed among the army. So this is what this was one measure. I mean, this was one area which Islam needed uh, a very strong directive, and the other area was about existing slaves who were already found in households in a very large number. So two distinct categories and two distinct separate spheres must be understood. So one was the creation of new slaves, or the making of new slaves, and the other was how to deal with existing slaves. So as far as the first category is concerned, in which making of new slaves was the issue, So Islam gave a directive, or the Quran gave a directive, in which it immediately said that when there is a war between Muslims and the disbelievers, so this directive was revealed uh, close to the Battle of Badr. That was the first formal war between the Muslims and the Quraysh. So the Quran said, if there is this, after this war, you cannot capture prisoners of war and make them slaves. So in Surah Muhammad, this directive was revealed that if you capture these prisoners of war, you must set them free, either through ransom or without ransom. This, in fact, meant that no new slave would now be inducted in a household or in the army. So every free person caught in a battle was to be set free either through ransom or without ransom. Of course, there was an exception in the case of people who were war criminals. So about them, that was something else. Of course, they would be punished, but then they could not be made slaves. So as far as the induction of new slaves was concerned, Islam gave an immediate order. It did not adopt a gradual way because it was not needed. Any new slave was absolutely proscribed, and it was said that if you capture any slave, any prisoner of war, then he or she must be liberated either with ransom or without ransom. So this takes care of one category, which means that Islam meant business. It was serious in eliminating this inhuman institution at all cost. Now, the question that has left us to be tackled is that what was to be done, or what was supposed to be done, with slaves which already existed or which already were found in various households in large numbers. So it is for this that Islam adopted a gradual strategy, because they were part of every household. So remember, new slaves were stopped, and this, of course, had to occur in Medina, because the first wars, or the wars that Prophet or the believers fought against the disbelievers, they started in Medina. So as far as the induction of new slaves was concerned, that was taken care of. Now comes this issue of slaves which existed in the Muslim society already. So for them, as I said earlier on, this gradual process was adopted. And this gradual process started off by a very, very emotional appeal from the Quran. And Surah Balad, the words are Fakku Rakaba, which means release the necks. It is as if these necks are under yokes and you have fettered them, and you need to untie those fetters and set people free. So the Quran did not say liberate slaves. I mean, this was a common Arabic word or an expression that could have been used. Instead, the expression the Quran used was Fakku Rakaba, which means release these necks. You have tied them. It's like this yoke of slavery around the necks of people. Just untie them and let them go. So it was more of an appeal, which actually was a signal of what was to come in the future. Let me also narrate before you how the Prophet asked us that, as far as this appeal is concerned, which the Quran has shown, what he himself in this regard had said. So he said that whoever liberated a Muslim slave, the Almighty, in return for every limb of that slave, would shield every limb of that person from hell. So again, as the Quran had briefly spoken by saying the words, release necks, or just liberate these people who are under the yokes of slavery, in a similar way, the Prophet himself urged people that they must set free these people that are working with them in these conditions. And it says that in return for every limb of that slave, the Almighty would shield every limb of that person from hell. So that was a huge appeal that was sounded. So this was the first step. This was the first measure which the Quran took in emancipating slaves. It was a gradual way, and the first step it took was that this appeal was sounded in a very emotional way. The second step that was taken by Islam was that it underscored that slaves must be treated with kindness and compassion and sympathy. You cannot be harsh to your slave. You cannot treat that slave in any way which is subhuman, which is inhuman, or which is below his dignity. And this was again said in a very, very vehement way, in a very overwhelming way, so that people who have these slaves realize that these are not commodities, these are not assets that they own, these are human beings, these are living beings, and hence they must be treated at par with all these living beings. So the second measure was that this treatment of kindness, this treatment of uh, treating these slaves with humanity and compassion was made to pervade in the fabric of the society. I'm just going to narrate before you certain narratives of the Prophet as well, which actually underscore this kind treatment. So Abu Huraira reports that a slave has a right to food and clothing, and he shall not be asked to carry out an errand that is beyond him. Again, something which is absolutely a fair thing, that you must give him, the slave, whatever sustenance he or she needs, and tasks which are beyond the capacity must not be assigned. So remember, this is basically a reminder to us that in those times, this bonded labor, as we know, it was at its inhuman worst. And these laborers or these bondsmen, these slaves, would be assigned tasks which would be literally stupendous. It would be beyond them. It were Herculean in nature, and they would be expected to carry them out. But the Prophet said that no, you just cannot ask a slave of those times to do anything which is beyond his capacity. Then there is a narrative from Abu Zar Ghifari. He says that they are your brothers. The Almighty has made them subservient to you. So whatever you eat, feed them with it. Whatever you wear, clothe them with it. They were never asked to do something which is beyond them. And if there is such a task, then help them out with it. Now, this underscores a very important area, and that is that their status must be enhanced. And how? If you are going to feed your slave with the same food that you are eating, and if you have to clothe him or her in the same way that you are clothing your own self, what would this lead to? This would lead to the fact that it would become very difficult for people to keep slaves, because if they have to enhance or increase their standard of living and bring it closer to their own standard of living, this would become virtually impossible to maintain a large army of slaves and feed them and clothe them of the same standard. So basically, this had this underpinning in that as far as slaves are concerned, you must raise the standard of living, must not assign them to with tasks which are beyond them. And the purpose was that people would liberate slaves, because if they have to maintain slaves with their own standard of living, it would become virtually impossible, and this would actually result in them liberating and emancipating them. And then we have another narrative from Abdullah ibn Umar. He says that whoever slapped a slave or beat him up should atone this sin by liberating him. Again, telling us that how important it is to uh, treat the slaves in a dignified way. And if something happens of this sort, then there is no remedy except to liberate a slave. If you have been harsh, if you have been cruel, if you have done something bad to your slave, then saying sorry is not enough. You must liberate that slave. That is the only way out. Similarly, Abu Masud Ansari. So he says, once when I was beating my slave, I heard a voice from behind me. O Abu Masud, you should know that the Almighty has more power over you. When I turned back, I found that it was the Prophet. I immediately remarked, O Messenger of God, I release him for the sake of God. The Prophet said, had you not done this, you would have been given the punishment of the fire. Again, telling us that beating a slave or using this harsh treatment is something which is absolutely uncalled for. And if something of this happens, then the only atonement is that you set free that slave and nothing less. So this all in all shows that basically the second step, or the second gradual step that was taken by the Quran in order to make people realize that as far as slavery is concerned, it shall be soon totally proscribed. But steps are now generally being taken so that people get this hint and set them free of their own accord. So as far as another measure is concerned, that we come to realize that in cases of, for example, unintentional murder, in cases of zihar and similar offenses, liberation of a slave was actually regarded as their atonement. So this was a third step which Islam took, that if you have to atone for a sin, I mean, there could have been various atonements. You could have been punished for that. You could have, fed people. You could have clothed them, as is the case for the atonement of an oath. But another thing that was placed for this atonement was that, as an atonement for certain offenses, like, for example, zihar, unintentional murder, one of the atonement methods was that you must liberate a slave. So this again showed this clear intention of the Quran, that slowly and gradually the Quran wants that people who are sinning or making these public offenses, one way to atone for those is that you have to liberate a slave. Another measure, I would say this is the fourth measure that was adopted, was that the Quran said that you should marry off slave men and women who are of capable age. I mean, if they are able to marry one another, marry them off, because this would then again make them members of the society. And again, morally and ethically, they would have a higher status, because if they are, I mean, lose character, for example, or they have this moral misconduct in them, then by marrying off slave men and women to one another, it was a chance that they would be given to lead a normal life. Of course, this would be difficult for people to marry men and women who have loose character. This is a cultural misadjustment, but this would have been certainly something that did happen, and it could happen, that men and women who were equally morally corrupt or had looser character, they would be wedded off to one another, so that once again they do not live in a life of sin, and they live as proper husband and wife. And then we also find that if a person was to marry a slave woman of someone, great care was exercised. So the Quran has said in Surah Nisa that if you don't find women from your own sort, you can marry slave women who are kept chaste. So slave women were encouraged to be married to in case they were chaste. So again, this was something that raised the standard of living of these slaves. Then the sixth measure that was adopted was that as far as slaves are concerned, fornication, I would say, or let me also say that as far as the sixth measure is concerned, there was a head that was fixed in the public treasury, and that was that a specific head would be, or a specific amount of money should be given to the public treasury, and that money would be used to buy slaves and set them free. So that was another thing that was adopted by the Quran, that as far as the money was concerned, the zakat money was concerned, it would be collected by the state, and one portion of that zakat money would be used to buy off slaves from their masters and then have them set free. And the seventh measure, view that was adopted, was that fornication was regarded as prohibited. Now remember, it was these prostitution centers which flourished amongst these slave women, especially. And once fornication was proscribed and it was made a prohibited item or a prohibited thing, this again was something that put a stop to it. And then we also find, dear viewers, that the Quran also changed our mental attitude towards slaves by telling us that we must not call a slave by the name slave. For in the Arabic word, the word used for a slave is ghulam, and the female equivalent is ama. So instead of using these words, the Quran says you use the words that you use for free men and women, which is fata and fatat, or boy or girl that you would say, or a man or a woman. So it was prohibited that you would use the word slave in order to address them. And this again went a long way in changing the psyche of people, as we all know. And it was actually said that people should be treated as slaves of slaves of God, and not slaves of any individual. Now, as far as the Quran is concerned, these measures went a long way in eradicating and in changing the mindset. But then another drastic step, I would say, was taken by the Prophet himself. And he actually asked his cousin, Zainab bint Jahash, to marry his own slave, Zayd ibn Harisa, who he had set free. So remember, even if a slave was set free, the mindset about that slave would not change much, and still people would have this baggage that, well, once upon a time he was a slave. Even if he or she is now liberated from those shackles, what does it matter? In the past, he or she was a slave. So in order to curb this mindset, the Prophet actually convinced Zainab bint Jahash, his cousin. Of course, she was a very well-groomed, a very highly respected, a noble woman of the Arab society. And the Prophet said that, well, he would like his liberated slave boy, who was Zayd ibn Harisa, that she could marry him. And the intention of the Prophet was that if a slave or a former slave would get married to a noble woman of the Arab society, then this would raise the standard of slaves, and slowly they would become acceptable in the society. Yes, we know from history that this marriage could not last much, and ultimately Zayd ibn Harisa had to divorce Zainab because he thought that, well, she and he, there is a marked difference between the two, and he's not able to stare her in the eye, and he's not even able to be a husband the way a husband should be. So that class difference struck in his mind. He could not maintain that, and in spite of the Prophet's uh, pleadings, I would say, which are mentioned in the Quran, that please don't divorce your wife like this, because the Prophet knew the repercussions. But Zayd could not help it, and he ended up divorcing. But nonetheless, it shows how far the Prophet went so that he could liberate or have the standard of living of these slaves be raised to such an extent. So these were the gradual measures, as I said, which were adopted for those slaves who already existed. And then one final measure that was taken by the Quran is something that I'd like to mention before you. This is mentioned in Surah Nur, which is the 24th Surah of the Quran, and this is verse 33. It says, وَالَّذِينَ يَبْتَغُونَ الْكِتَابَ مِمَّا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ فَكَاتِبُوهُمْ إِنْ عَلِمْتُمْ فِيهِمْ خَيْرًا وَآتُوهُمْ مِمَّا اللَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ. And if any of your slaves ask for mukatabat, give it to them if you know any good in them, and for this, give them out of the wealth which Allah has given to you. So this term of mukatabat, it is used in the Quran, which means uh, an agreement which would be made between the slave, the who would aspire to become free, that he or she will guarantee by doing a certain task or certain chore that she will not or he will not become an economic burden on the society and live as a graceful person. So the Quran finally said that every single slave who would like himself or herself to be liberated and be emancipated, set free, if he or she would guarantee this, which was called mukathabat, then it was incumbent upon the master to liberate that person at all cost. So this is what sealed, I would say, the fate of slavery. It was the last nail in the coffin of this inhuman institution. So previously, we have seen how measures were adopted in which gradually it became clear that this institution is being proscribed, but this is being done slowly. But finally, viewers, we can see that near the end of the Prophet's tenure, it seems that this directive was given. Now, the question here that might arise in your minds is that if the Quran is so clear, and if there are so many narratives which have appealed to the emotions of the Muslims to liberate slaves, if this is so clear, then why is it? What on earth has made our scholars or majority scholars still believe that slavery is something which is sanctioned by religion? I think, in my personal assessment, the reason for this is by not understanding two verses from the Quran. So one of them is in Surah Mu'minun, and the other is in Surah Mawrid, and both have the same. I mean, they have the same, almost similar words. So it says that these verses say actually that sexual relations between a person who is a chaste person, who is a pious person. So these verses or these words occur when the Quran is enumerating the qualities of a believer, how good he should be. So whenever you'll find these instances being narrated, particularly in these two instances, you'll see that the words used are that they do not. The words are illa ala azwajihim aw ma malakat aymanuhum, that they do not commit extramarital sex except with their wives or with their slave girls. Now, this is the cause of misconception, I would say, because these two verses still exist in the Quran, and when you find them in these two surahs, of course, you would say that, well, you can have sexual relations with your wives and with your slave women. How could the Quran proscribe them when it clearly says so? So you have to understand, and this is the point that we need to be very careful of, that during the time that slavery was being gradually eliminated, remember that was a gradual elimination. So the door for any new slave was shut tightly when it was said that you cannot entertain any new slave, you cannot make any prisoner of war a slave. So that was the end of that. But for existing slaves, these gradual measures were adopted, and it was only later in the times of the Prophet when it was totally banned. But during that time, because of this gradual elimination, this sanction was still given to slavery. So remember, it was that transient period in which slavery had not yet been fully proscribed, but there was a tremendous movement against it going on, that liberate slaves, make them equal to your status, do not call them as slaves, etc., etc. Some of the measures that I have just referred to. But during this time, although an appeal was being made, But slavery was still given sanction until, as I said, the very last verses were revealed, which are the verse of Mukatibat, which I just read out before you. So during that time, of course, sanction was given because, as I said, it was not an immediate order of prescription or prohibition. So these two verses, they became, to me, it seemed that they became the cause of this misconception that because Islam has said that people can have sexual relations with their wives and with their slave women, that they think that this is an eternal directive, without realizing that these two verses were actually revealed during the time when slavery was still in vogue, but it was being gradually eliminated. Until that time happened, it was that interim period in which these verses were revealed. So, without realizing that these were the interim verses for that period in which slavery was, although being, through an emotional appeal, it was being eradicated, but still it did not stand eradicated until a certain point of time. And before that point of time arrived, this sanction was still given, this allowance was still given, and consequently, we find that the Prophet himself had a slave, Maria, who was gifted to him by the king of Egypt, and I will discuss more about it when you have questions. But as I said, this was one reason that the Prophet had a slave woman gifted to him, and he did not set her free. The reason, of course, that I have always tried to divulge is that during the time slavery was being given sanction, someone had to show how to treat slave women. So the Prophet, it seems that he made it a point not to liberate her, because that would have been not only disastrous for her, because she had come from a foreign land, she would have no place to go back, because it was a custom in those times that you just could not return a royal gift. And at the same time, of course, there was an example that needed to be set before Muslims that who were still keeping slaves, that if you have to keep a slave woman, and this is how you should keep her. And the way the Prophet dealt with Maria, it speaks volumes of how he actually treated her like his wife, although she was not in the status of his wife. But the benefits that she enjoyed, the respect that she enjoyed, was no less, if not more. So, as I said, that those verses actually belong to that interim period, and without realizing that these verses belong to that interim period, scholars have made these two verses as directives which give an eternal guidance that you can have sexual relations with your wives and with your slave women. And as I said, this is something that belonged to that interim period. So with this, I have come to an end to this topic, and also with this to this whole major topic of social Sharia, by just summing this up before you, that slavery was gradually eradicated, and talking about that part in which slaves existed. But as far as new slaves were to be made, that was done by a single directive of the Quran, that no new slaves would be made. But as far as the existing ones were concerned, they would be gradually eliminated because of their deeply rooted nature. And once this had happened, we know from Surah Nur that every single slave was given this permission, or given this permit, that he or she could guarantee his or her own freedom from his master and lead a normal life. So now we turn to you, and we open this forum for any Q&A that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad, for a beautiful explanation and clearing the misconceptions around this great, important topic. So now we are taking the questions. So if please raise your hands if you have any questions, or type in the chat. Bisma Termizi, please unmute your mic and ask your question.
So, Dr. Saleem, Assalamualaikum. I just got a direct question in the chat. That's why I'm asking you that question. Somebody just asked that is it necessary to recite the azan in the ear of a newborn child, and if it's important to say the surahs in sequence?
Well, as far as the second question is concerned, if the questioner is asking about reading the surahs in the namaz or in the prayer, this is not
in the ear of a newborn child.
In the ear of a newborn child. Okay. So as far as reading azan or the surahs in the newborn is concerned, this is a much later addition than the Prophet himself. The first few centuries are absolutely devoid of this tradition. It is something that developed much later. This is evident if you look at history. So people today think that for a newborn, it is a part of the ritual of a newborn that you have to shave his head or give the azan in his or her ear. I mean, both these, as far as shaving off the head is concerned, this is an entirely optional thing. It's more of a hygienic thing that you might do. It has got nothing to do with religion. And as far as reciting the azan is concerned, again, this was never found in the times of the Prophet. In fact, the first couple of centuries are totally devoid of any such practice, and it is a much later thing that got developed. I mean, it got in vogue, and now it is as if everyone it's become so famous and it's become so pervasive that everyone thinks that it is part of the Islamic rulings, whereas it is absolutely not part of it.
Simanil Siddiqui, please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yes, Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Shehzad. Really interesting lecture. I just wanted to know, could you please repeat the surahs that are relevant to the topic of slavery, and if there's any additional book or reading that you might recommend? That's my one question. And my second question is that if we were then today, in fact, sitting with individuals and this topic was to come up, can we now safely assume after this lecture that indeed this is not a practice that is that this is a practice that is misunderstood? The fact that women slaves can be taken in the modern world as we know it today to be used for sexual relations.
So, as I said, yes, this is an absolutely fair assessment that you have made, but do have this, take this with a pinch of salt, and do remember that when you talk to people who are already religiously inclined, if they differ with you, they will differ with you because of that, as I just said, that misunderstanding, that because of those two verses which say that you can have relations with your slave women, notwithstanding the fact that those two verses belong to that interim period, because they think that these verses have an eternal, so to speak, circle of application, so they might not agree with you. So that is why I have presented their view as well. So before an educated audience, of course, you can present this and tell them that this is the counter narrative of the general narrative in which people think that slavery is rampant. So in fact, what I've just divulged before you is the counter narrative against slavery. And as far as these verses are concerned and the necessary or the relevant ahadith are concerned, I will advise you to look up two sources. So one of them is the tafsir of the Quran of Ustaz Amin and Islahi. You'll find it in the English language as well. This is Surah number 24, Surah Nur. And he has written a chapter on slavery during that exegesis of that surah, and he has outlined all these measures and Quranic verses. And the second source is of Ustaz Javed Ghamidi, his book Meezan, also found in the English language by the name Islam: A Comprehensive Introduction. So if you look up the chapter on slavery, there's a chapter which is on slavery. So he has also given some more resources from Hadith literature which might be useful for your consumption.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, which particular surah did you say is misunderstood?
Yes, so these are two verses from Surah Mu'minun, which is the 23rd surah of the Quran, and the other is Surah Ma'arij, which is the 70th surah of the Quran. And you'll find the Arabic words as وَالَّذِينَ هُمْ لِفُرُوجِهِمْ حَافِظُونَ إِلَّا عَلَىٰ أَزْوَاجِهِمْ أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُهُمْ, which means that these individuals are those who guard their private parts, who guard their sexual organs, except from their wives and from their slave ladies. So these words are exactly the same in both these surahs. So these two, as I said, just repeating it again, that these are the two instances in which that interim directive was given. Because in those that gradual period of eradication, the time of proscription arrived near the end of the Prophet's ministry. So during that time, these verses had to be revealed, that pious people are those who do not commit any extra marital relation. So during that temporary period, having sex with your slave lady and with your wife was equivalent. It would be as if you're guarding your chastity. You're not looking outside your marriage bond. But as I said, this was also for a particular period.
Sarfaraz Namath, please unmute your mic and ask your question.
Some of the people, they ask that the slavery should remain in recent period as well, because if a man doesn't has financial strength, then he in the Quran it was mentioned that he can marry with the slave woman. So what should be the solution in recent time? Because now slavery woman is not available.
And that particular verse deals with that part of the prophetic era in which slavery was still given sanction. So basically, the two verses I cited, they are exactly of the same era in which the verse that you have cited occurs, that you can marry slave women. This verse also is it also belongs to the same temporary period or the same transient period in which slavery was given sanction, it was allowed, gradually eliminated. So this is the third example that you've given. Besides those two verses, this is another instance which belongs to that temporary era. It is not this is not something which belongs to.
So, but it was it not good that in this recent time it is because of not having marriage, the problem in our society is arising because of lack of marriages, late marriage, creating problem in the society.
Suggested by religion, for example, you can marry another wife. I mean, this is something that is the suggestion, but to make someone a slave, as I said earlier on, the Quran has proscribed it totally. It has said that you cannot make any slave because you see, the only source for slaves were these wars. I mean, you don't have any slave markets anymore. In the time of the Prophet, the only source was these wars. But for these wars, the Quran had immediately said that you cannot make any of these prisoners of war as slaves. So it actually shut the door to any new slaves. So, I mean, slavery just cannot exist because this was the only source. And once that door was shut, you could not have caught any new slaves. I mean, you see, today people, if they think that slavery still exists, they still think that today prisoners of war can be converted into slaves. That is the misconception that they have. I have tried to clarify this, but in which the very first battle, which is the Battle of Badr, was fought, is narrated. It is said that you cannot capture these prisoners of war and make them slaves. You must set them free either with ransom or without ransom.
What should be the solution for recent time? Because now slavery is not.
The solution is that if you have that extra sexual, maybe you should marry another lady, maybe, or treat yourself, but you cannot go along and have relations with anyone. I mean, that is what the Quran has said. The only way out is to have a wife.
Thank you, Dr. Shehzad. There was one question that I had was that we also learned that the problem of alcohol was also Allah sent gradually the verses of that alcohol is not is prohibited. They were sent like gradually. It was not a thing that was banned or prohibited just like in one go. So why is that not something that is have misconceptions or around it, but this issue has it? So are there not any verses?
Yes, I understand. So as far as alcohol is concerned, it was always regarded to be prohibited. These verses which speak of its prohibition, they relate to that instance in which it becomes a culpable crime. So you see, there is a difference between a sin and a crime. As far as it being a sin is concerned, it is something which is mentioned in the previous scriptures also, and the Quran also speaks of it as if it is a sin. However, this gradual prohibition, I mean, in which it is said that you do not go near the prayer place when you are drunk, and La taqrabu salata wa antum sukara, or directives are similar. What they are trying to tell us that soon this drinking or alcohol consumption will become a culpable crime. It will no longer remain a sin. It will become a crime in which you'll be held culpable and you'll be, given a punishment for that. So initially, it was just a sin. As far as these directives are concerned, they do not, for the first time, tell us that Islam is prohibiting alcohol. All that it tells us is that now this sin is now becoming a crime. It will be treated as a crime and would be punished as an offense.
Thank you. So how do we know that is this the revelation of the verses is during the time and because of the background, or is it actually mentioned in the Quran that tells us that these verses were specifically revealed during the time when they were the slavery was in the period of transient period, and these specific verses were released when it was completely prohibited.
So as I said, if you look at the Quran, it tells us that this is a dirty handiwork of Satan. So in Surah Al-Ma'idah it says, "Ritsu min amali shaitan," that this drinking and liquor and gambling, these are the dirty handiwork of Satan, which itself tells us that it is something prohibited. Also, if you look at the Bible and the previous scriptures, you'll find something very similar. So you see, anything puts our intellect into jeopardy, anything which makes us inebriated and become indifferent, it stood prohibited in the previous scriptures also, and the Quran has continued with that prohibition. The only addition that it has made is that now it said that it will become a culpable crime. It will be punished as well.
Right, I understand. Thank you so much, Dr. Shehzad. We will be concluding our session here. Thank you everyone for participating. Have a great rest of the day.